Okay, so let's launch dbeaver and let's connect to our Postgres database. So what we do is go over here to the database navigator, right click here, and let's go create new connection. In create new connection, we'll just pick PostgreSQL. That's the type of database that we're connecting to. We'll hit next. So what we're doing in this screen is we're setting up a connection to our Postgres database, which is actually running as a server on our computer. So our host is set as localhost. That refers to our computer. The port that the database server is running on is 5432, and that's the same port number that you would have seen when you were going through the installation steps for Postgres. So if you changed that from its default, make sure you enter in the right port number here. When we're setting up a connection to our server, we want to specify the default database that we're going to connect with. A database server can actually host many databases, and the default database that we want to connect to, at least initially for this video, has the name Postgres. It's a default database that just gets created for us. It's not one that we created ourselves. We're going to connect with the username Postgres. During the installation, I told you to enter in a password and then write down or remember the password for that super user. So here is where we enter that password. What we'll now do is just click test connection. We just want to make sure that we can connect to our database correctly. And I got a success straight away. If this is your first time actually using dbeaver though, and trying to connect to your Postgres database, what you may get here is a prompt to install the appropriate drivers. If you do see this prompt, just click the download button. Once that completes, you should get a successful connection to your database. Let's click OK. And finally, under settings, make sure that show non-default databases is ticked. Or if you're on a Mac, the setting might be called show all databases. Again, make sure that's ticked before proceeding. And now let's click finish. After clicking finish, you may be prompted to create a sample database as well. It's not a bad idea to have this. We won't really be using it through this course, but it's something that's handy to play with later. So feel free to just click yes on that. And once you do that, you'll be over here and you'll be able to see in the database navigator, there's now that Postgres database that we're connected with. And there's also that sample dbeaver database. Okay, so let's bring up a SQL editor, which is where we're going to be writing our SQL commands. Let's go to SQL editor, SQL editor. So let me quickly explain a couple of things. So let's go over here, let's expand the database navigator. And what we can see is that we're using that connection that we just set up. So we're connected to our Postgres database with the user Postgres, that's our super user. And that server is currently hosting one database, and that database has the name Postgres. We can expand that database, and we can expand schemas and the public schema, which I'll explain just in a moment as well. And we can see that there's tables, views, materialized views, and other objects. Let's expand tables. There's nothing in there. So this is an empty database with no tables. Earlier, I mentioned that databases contain tables. However, tables actually live within something called schemas. So a database contains schemas, and schemas contain tables. So you can think of a schema as basically a container of tables, views, stored procedures, functions, etc. Basically, everything that you see here listed under the public schema. What we want to do whenever we're working in our SQL editor is always make sure that we're targeting the right database and we're targeting the right schema. And we can see what our active database and active schema is here in the toolbar. Let's make sure that we're targeting our Postgres database. So let's select that. And then let's make sure that our active schema is the public schema and the Postgres database, which it is. So that's correct. What that means now is that any SQL statements that we write and that we execute will be run against the Postgres database, which is what we want. So rather than working with this Postgres database though, let's create our own database. let's write create database, and let's call it my first DB. What we want to do now is execute that SQL statement. And the way we do it is by going over here to this sidebar and clicking on Execute SQL Statement, or if you're on Windows, you can also press Control-Enter on your keyboard. We're executing that statement, and we've just created our first database. If we want to see that database, let's go over here to the Database Navigator. Let's click on our connection. We'll right-click on it, and we'll click Refresh. And there it is. There's our database that we just created. And we can expand that database, and we can see that it also has a public schema. By default, whenever you create a new Postgres database, it's going to come with a public schema. What we want to do now is we want to create a table within that database, and we want to put some data inside that table as well. So we want to write SQL statements, and when we run those SQL statements, we want to run those against that database that we just created. So let's go over to the Database Navigator. Let's right-click on the database that we just created, and let's select Set Active. Notice that when we did this, that the toolbar changed. Now it says public, so that's the public schema, at my first DB, which is the database that we just created. So it's still the same Postgres database instance that we're connected to, but we're just now connected to a different database, the my first DB database. So we've created the database. Let's go down now, and now let's create a table within that database. So let's type create table. Let's call it employees. Within that table, we're going to have 4 columns. Our first column is going to be called employee ID, and it's going to be of type int or integer. We're going to store the employee's first name, and that's going to be of type varchar 100. What that means is that the first name is text up to length 100. It's a variable length character array. We're going to store a last name, also going to be a varchar of length 100. And we're also going to store a higher date of type date. Let's move this down a little bit out of the way to give us some more working room, and we'll put a semicolon at the end of that statement. You should always end all SQL statements with semicolons. Now, something worth pointing out here is that what we want to do is we just want to execute this statement, this create table employees statement. We do not want to execute this statement again. We've already created the database, it's unnecessary. And that's going to be the typical way that we work throughout this course, and in general, just when you're working with databases. You often just want to execute one statement at a time. Our cursor right now is just on this create table employees statement. It's down here at the bottom. If we were to now go up and click execute SQL statement, what will happen is that we would only execute this statement. We would not be executing the create database statement. And that's exactly what we want. You can kind of think of this as like the way that you work with a command line, or if you've worked with something like Jupyter Notebooks or IPython before. What we're going to be doing is typically just executing one statement at a time. If we wanted to execute the whole script, so if we wanted to execute both the create database statement and the create table statement, what we could do is go over here to the sidebar and we would click execute script. Throughout this course, I'm pretty much exclusively just going to be using the execute SQL statement command. If I ever want you to execute the script, I'll let you know. So let's just execute this statement, this create table statement. If you want to see that table, come over here to the Database Navigator, My First DB, Public Schema, Tables, and we may need to hit refresh, and there it is. There's the employees table that we just created. Let's insert some data into that table. So let's insert in an employee ID 1. Let's use the first name John, last name Smith, and the hire date as 2010, July the 1st. And we could, let's insert, let's say just 2 records. So insert an employee ID of 2. This time we'll insert Peter Jones, and let's do a hire date of 2008, 1st of January. What I've now typed up here is a SQL statement to insert some data into that table. If you're following along, don't worry too much about the actual SQL statements that I'm writing. Later on in this course, I'm going to come back and explain these in more detail. The idea here is just to get comfortable typing in SQL statements into dbeaver, executing them against our database. So what I'm now going to do is execute that statement. And we can see down the bottom in our statistics, it says updated rows 2. So we've created this table of employees. We've inserted 2 people into that table. Now let's ensure that that worked correctly by just selecting from that table and making sure the records are in there. So we'll go to our editor, and what we'll type in this time is select star from employees. And we'll execute that statement. And throughout this course, I'm just going to be using keyboard shortcuts. So when I say let's execute that statement, I'm just going to be pressing Control Enter, or if you're on a Mac, the keyboard shortcut might be a little bit different. And there we are. We can see that there were 2 employees that we were able to successfully insert into our table. I mentioned earlier that we're working within the public schema, and so that's our namespace. What that means also is that if you want, you can refer to tables by a more fully qualified name. So while you can also just write select star from employees, and because we're connected to our public schema that works, you can also type in public.employees, and we can execute that, and it works just the same as well. So that's just a more fully qualified name to refer to your table by. Just retouching on the idea of schemas, what you may sometimes find in big databases is that there's multiple different schemas. So you may find that if you have a very, very big database with say like hundreds and hundreds of tables, that there's lots of different schemas that help organize those tables. And that provides some cleaner logical grouping and logical separation between tables. Right now, we don't really need that. We're just working with one table, so we're just working within the default public schema. So there's a couple of important things I should point out. The first is that SQL is case insensitive. So what that means is that you'll often find people writing those keywords like insert into and select in uppercase. In fact, that's quite common. Personally, I prefer using lowercase because I think it's just easier on typing. You basically just want to find your own style that works best for you. Similarly, there's no well-defined naming conventions that everybody agrees on for how to name tables or how to name attributes. Personally, I like to use the pluralized version of a noun for table names, so I called my table here employees, and my column names are all lowercase, and I use underscore to separate words. So I have employee underscore ID, first underscore name, last underscore name, and so on. Again, this is an area where people have different conventions. I think the main thing really though is just to be consistent within the code base that you're working with. When you're working in SQL, you can write comments into your code as well. So if we go down here, if we just wanted to write a comment that wasn't executed, what we do is use 2 dashes as follows, and this is a comment. So what that means is that if you were to execute the script, or if you tried to execute this as a SQL statement, nothing would happen. It's essentially ignored. And we leave comments in code just for our own benefit so that we can read them later on and remember what we were doing, or for the benefit of other developers who are working with our scripts. Let me quickly show you what an error looks like as well. So if you make a mistake while you're typing some SQL statements, let's have a look what that looks like. So let's say we did select star from, and we wrote employee with 1 E, and we tried to execute that statement. we get an error, and it says the relation employee does not exist. So throughout this course, as you're writing SQL commands and executing them, when you get errors like this, read the error description and try to figure out what you may have done wrong. Often it's going to be something simple, like you mistyped the name of a table or an attribute, or you forgot a comma somewhere. It's usually pretty simple to work out. Often what's helpful as well is just to take that error that you got, put it into Google, and have a read of some of the answers that people give. So we'll say OK on that. We'll fix up that query. We'll run that again, and now it works fine. So we created our first database. We created a table within that database, and we created that table within the default public schema. We inserted some data into that table, and then we wrote a query on that table to get the data out of it. That's really all we wanted to accomplish with this video, to get some familiarity with dbeaver. If we're done, we can now clean up. So what we can do is we can type in drop table employees, and we want to execute that. And what that did is delete that table. Let's go over here to our database navigator. Let's click on tables and let's refresh that. And our employees table is gone. You'll often find when you make changes like this, like creating a new table or deleting a table, you'll have to come over here to the database navigator and you'll have to refresh the parent just to make sure that that gets updated and is reflected in the view. So we're done with my first DB. If we want, we can just delete that database. If we try to go over here though, and we right click on the database and we click delete, we'll say yes. We'll get a warning that we can't delete that database because we're connected to it. It's the database that's currently active. So what we want to do is let's just hit OK on that. Let's go over here to our database navigator and let's change the active database. So let's right click on Postgres, that's the default database. Let's click Set Active. And so that's bolded, that means that's our active database. And so now we can go back, we can right click on My First DB and we can click Delete. And that database is gone. And you'll see reflected up here in the toolbar as well. Obviously the connection has remained unchanged. We're still connected to the same database server, but now our editor is connected to the public schema on the Postgres database. So if we were to write a SQL statement here, if we were to try to create a table, that would all happen on the Postgres database inside the public schema. So this has been a quick overview of dbeaver and just writing some basic SQL commands. I'm going to come back later in future videos and you'll get very intimately familiar with all of these different SQL commands that we wrote. But the goal here was just to play around with dbeaver, spend some time in it, get familiar with connections, get familiar with databases and creating tables. What I'd recommend that you do after watching this video is spend a little bit of time inside dbeaver. If you want, you can create some more databases and you can practice creating some tables within the database. Get familiar with using the execute SQL statement command. And if you want, try out executing a script as well. So write several SQL statements in a row and then execute script. And you'll see that it will execute all of those statements rather than just the current statement. If you want, you can also try out using execute SQL statement in a new tab. And you can also try out using execute the script with all of the results appearing in their own tabs. In the next video, what you're going to be doing is taking a script and using that to create the sample database that we're going to be working with for the remainder of this course.